The cold morning air bit through Maria Santos' thin prison uniform as she stood with 179 other women in the dusty courtyard of Camp Delta, a notorious detention facility on the border between two war-torn countries. The year was 1943, and the world was engulfed in a conflict that seemed to have no end. Maria had been captured 3 weeks ago while trying to smuggle medical supplies to resistance fighters hiding in the mountains. At 24 years old, Maria had already lived through more hardship than most people would face in a lifetime. Her village had been destroyed 2 years earlier. Her family scattered to the winds, and she had joined the underground resistance movement out of necessity rather than choice. She wasn't a soldier by training, just a nurse who had learned to be brave when circumstances demanded it. The women around her came from different backgrounds, different countries, and different walks of life. But they all shared the same look of defiance mixed with fear. Some were political prisoners, others had been caught helping refugees escape, and a few were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time when the military swept through their towns. They had been brought here from various camps across the region, and nobody knew exactly why they had been gathered together, Commander. Wilhelm Brass stood on the raised platform overlooking the courtyard, his crisp uniform bearing the insignia of his rank. He was a man in his 40s, known throughout the military for his strict adherence to protocol and his unwavering loyalty to his superiors. His reputation preceded him wherever he went, and the guards under his command both respected and feared him in equal measure. The women had been standing in formation since before dawn, and the sun was now climbing higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the dusty ground. Maria's legs ached, and her mouth was dry, but she kept her eyes forward and her back straight. She had learned early in her captivity that showing weakness only invited more cruelty from the guards. Commander Brass cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. He explained that new regulations had been implemented, requiring all prisoners to undergo thorough medical examinations and searches. The women would be processed in groups, and any attempt to resist or cause disruption would result in severe consequences for everyone. Maria felt her heart sink as she realized what this meant. She had heard whispers from other prisoners about these so-called medical examinations, which were often nothing more than humiliating searches designed to break down the prisoner's dignity and spirit. The thought of being forced to undress in front of strangers filled her with dread. But she knew that resistance would only make things worse for herself and the other women. As the commander continued his speech about procedure and compliance, Maria's mind wandered to the small tattoo hidden beneath her clothing. It was barely 2 inches long, positioned just below her left shoulder blade, and it held a significance that went far beyond its simple appearance. She had gotten it done by an old tattoo artist in her village just before everything fell apart, and it represented something that she had never spoken about to anyone, not even her closest friends in the resistance. The tattoo was a small musical note intertwined, with a date, the 15th of August, 1923, to anyone else. It would look like a random design, perhaps commemorating a special song or a memorable concert. But to Maria, it represented the most important day of her life, a day that had shaped everything she had become and everything she believed in. It was her secret, her private memorial to something beautiful in a world that had become increasingly ugly and brutal. As commander, Ross finished his announcement, and the guards began organizing the women into smaller groups. Maria tried to prepare herself mentally for what was to come. She told herself that she could endure this humiliation like she had endured everything else. The tattoo would be seen, questions might be asked, but she would give them no more information than absolutely necessary. The first group of 20 women was led toward a large building at the far end of the courtyard. Maria watched them disappear through the heavy wooden doors, and she wondered if she would have the strength to maintain her dignity when her turn came. The waiting was almost worse than the anticipation of the examination itself, as her imagination conjured up scenarios that might be even worse than the reality she was about to face. Hours passed like days as group after group of women disappeared into the examination building. Some returned to the courtyard looking shaken but intact, while others were taken directly to different sections of the camp. Maria began to worry about what criteria were being used to separate them. The sun was now high overhead, beating down mercilessly on the remaining prisoners who, continued to stand in formation. Maria found herself in the 7th group, along with 19 other women who looked just as anxious and determined as she felt. Among them was Alina, a schoolteacher from a neighboring country who had been caught harboring refugee children, and Anna, a young mother who had been separated from her baby when she was arrested for distributing anti-government leaflets. These women had become her closest allies during their time in captivity, sharing what little food they could save and offering comfort during the darkest moments when their group was finally called. They walked slowly toward the building, each woman lost in her own thoughts and fears. The guards flanking them carried rifles and wore expressions that suggested they had seen this process many times before. Maria tried to memorize details about the building's layout as they walked, partly out of habit from her resistance training, but mostly as a way to distract herself from what was about to happen. Inside the building, they were led down a long corridor lined with small rooms. The walls were painted a sickly green color that reminded Maria of hospitals. Though this place felt nothing like the healing environments where she had worked as a nurse, the floors were concrete and their footsteps echoed hollowly as they moved deeper into the facility. They were brought to a large room where Commander Brass was waiting, along with several subordinate officers and what appeared to be medical personnel. The commander's presence surprised Maria, as she had assumed he would delegate this unpleasant task to his underlings. His face showed no emotion as he looked over the group of women, and Maria wondered what he was thinking behind those cold, calculating eyes. The procedure was explained to them in clinical terms that made it sound routine and necessary. Though everyone in the room understood the real purpose behind it, the women would be required to remove all clothing and personal items, which would be searched and catalogued. They would then undergo a physical examination, ostensibly for health reasons. Though Maria suspected it was more about psychological intimidation than medical care. One by one, the women were called forward. Maria watched as Alina stepped up first, her hands trembling slightly as she began to remove her prison uniform. The teacher maintained her dignity as best she could, keeping her eyes fixed on a point on the wall behind the commander's head, refusing to let them see her break down as each woman went through the process. Maria noticed that Commander Brass seemed to be paying particular attention to any marks, scars, or tattoos on their bodies. He would make notes on a clipboard, occasionally asking questions about the origin or meaning of various marks. Most of the women had work-related scars or small identifying marks, but none seemed to provoke any particular reaction from him. Anna was called next, and Maria could see the young mother struggling to hold back tears as she complied with the orders. When it was discovered that Anna had a small birthmark on her back shaped like a crescent moon, the commander asked several questions about it, but seemed satisfied when she explained its natural origin. The process was taking longer than Maria had expected, and she began to realize that this wasn't just a routine search or examination. The commander was looking for something specific, something that would help him identify particular individuals, or perhaps uncover hidden information about the resistance networks that had been operating in the region. When Maria's turn finally came, her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. She stepped forward on unsteady legs, trying to channel the courage that had carried her through previous dangerous situations. As she began to remove her uniform, she found herself thinking about her tattoo and wondering if this would be the moment when her past caught up with her in ways she had never anticipated. The commander watched her with the same clinical detachment he had shown to the other women, but Maria sensed something different in his demeanor, a slight tension that hadn't been there before. She couldn't understand why she felt like he was studying her more intently than he had the others, but the feeling made her even more nervous about what was about to be revealed. As Maria removed the last piece of her clothing, she felt exposed and vulnerable in a way that went beyond the physical. The room was cold, and she could feel goosebumps rising on her skin, but she forced herself to stand straight and maintain eye contact with the commander. She had promised herself that she wouldn't give these people the satisfaction of seeing her. Completely broken down, the medical examination proceeded routinely at first. The doctor, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, checked her pulse, looked in her ears and throat, and made notes about her general physical condition. Maria was relieved to find that he conducted himself professionally. Unlike some of the horror stories she had heard from other prisoners about brutal examinations conducted by sadistic guards, Commander Brass stood several feet away, observing the process with the same methodical attention he had given to all the other women. Maria began to think that perhaps her fears about the tattoo had been unfounded, that it would be just another mark to be noted and forgotten. She allowed herself to relax slightly, thinking that the worst part of this ordeal was nearly over. Then the doctor asked her to turn around so he could examine her back. And Maria's heart began to race again. She turned slowly, knowing that within moments, her secret would be exposed to the room full of strangers. She tried to prepare herself for questions about the tattoo, rehearsing in her mind the simple explanation who would give about it being a memorial to a favorite piece of music. The doctor began his examination of her back, checking for any signs of injury or illness, when suddenly his hands stopped moving. Maria couldn't see his face, but she could sense that something had changed in the room. The doctor cleared his throat and spoke to the commander in a voice that seemed unusually tense. "Sir, you should take a look at this," the doctor said, and Maria felt her stomach drop. She knew that her tattoo had been discovered, but something in the doctor's tone suggested that this was more significant than she had expected. Commander Brass approached, his boots clicking on the concrete floor with each deliberate step. Maria could feel his presence behind her, and she imagined his cold eyes studying the small tattoo that she had kept hidden for so many years. The room was completely silent, except for the sound of her own breathing, which seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. What happened next was completely unexpected. Instead of asking questions about the tattoo or making notes on his clipboard, Commander Brass made a sound that Maria couldn't quite identify. It was somewhere between a gasp and a whisper, as if he had seen something that shocked him to his core. "Everyone out," the commander said suddenly, his voice carrying a tone of authority that brooked no argument. Now, the doctor looked confused, as did the other officers and guards in the room. This was clearly not part of the standard procedure, and Maria could sense their uncertainty about how to respond. But Commander Brass repeated his order, more forcefully this time, and the room began to clear. "We haven't finished the examination," the doctor protested. But the commander cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I said everyone out. Close the door behind you." Within moments, Maria found herself alone in the room with Commander Brass, still standing naked with her back to him, completely confused about what was happening. She could hear her heart beating in her ears, and she wondered if this sudden change in procedure meant that her situation had somehow become much worse. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. Maria didn't dare turn around without permission, but she was desperate to understand what was happening. Finally, she heard the commander's voice behind her, and it sounded completely different from the cold, authoritative tone he had used throughout the day. "Where did you get that tattoo?" he asked, and Maria was stunned to hear what sounded like emotion in his voice. Gone was the clinical detachment, placed by something that sounded almost like pain. Maria turned slowly to face him, unsure of what she would see. The commander was standing several feet away, but his expression was completely transformed. The cold, calculating look was gone, replaced by something that looked like shock, confusion, and perhaps even recognition. "I asked you a question," he said, but even his repeated demand lacked the harsh authority from before. He seemed almost fragile, as if the sight of her tattoo had somehow stripped away the protective shell of military discipline and revealed something much more human underneath. Maria found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I got it in my village, before the war started," she said, watching the commander's face carefully for any clue about why this simple tattoo had affected him so dramatically. Commander Brass moved closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "What does it mean? The date, the musical note, what do they represent?" Maria hesitated, unsure of how much she should reveal. The tattoo represented the most precious memory of her life, something she had never shared with anyone, not even her closest friends. But something in the commander's expression suggested that this wasn't just idle curiosity or an attempt to extract information for military purposes. "It's the date of a concert," she said finally. August 15th, 1923, there was a small orchestra that came to perform in our village square. It was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. The commander's face went completely pale, and he seemed to sway slightly on his feet. He walked to a chair near the wall and sat down heavily, as if his legs could no longer support him. Maria watched in amazement as this powerful, intimidating military officer seemed to crumble before her eyes. "My God," he whispered, running his hands through his hair. "It can't be possible. After all these years, after everything that's happened." Maria was completely bewildered by his reaction, but she sensed that something extraordinary was happening. The commander looked up at her with eyes that were now filled with tears, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I was the pianist in that orchestra," he said. "August 15th, 1923, the village of Santa Rosa. We performed Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata and Mozart's Piano Concerto. No, 21. There was a little girl in the front row who never took her eyes off the piano the entire time." Maria felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. The memory came flooding back with perfect clarity. She had been 7 years old, sitting on her father's shoulders in the village square, completely mesmerized by the young man at the piano whose fingers seemed to dance across the keys like magic. She had dreamed about that music for weeks afterward, humming the melodies and pretending to play piano on any surface she could find. "That was you?" she managed to say, though the words felt surreal as they left her mouth. "You were the pianist?" Wilhelm nodded, tears now flowing freely down his cheeks. "I was 22 years old, fresh out of music school, and that tour through the mountain villages was supposed to be the beginning of my professional career. I remember that little girl so clearly because she was the most attentive audience member I had ever seen. After the concert, you came up to the stage with your father." The memory was crystal clear now. Maria remembered her father lifting her up so she could shake hands with the young pianist, remembered how kind he had been when she told him that she wanted to learn to play piano just like him. He had smiled and told her that music was the most beautiful gift anyone could give to the world. "You told me that day that music could change everything," Maria said, her own voice now choked with emotion. "You said that no matter what happened in life, if I could hold on to the beauty of music, I would never be truly lost." Wilhelm covered his face with his hands and sobbed. "I told you to remember that concert whenever you felt sad or scared," he said. "I told you that music was stronger than anything else in the world." The irony of the situation was overwhelming. Here they were, 20 years later, on opposite sides of a brutal war that had torn apart everything they had once believed in. The little girl who had been inspired by his music had grown up to become a resistance fighter, while the young pianist who had spoken about beauty and hope had become a military commander in an army known for its cruelty. Maria looked down at this man who had once been her hero, who had inadvertently shaped her entire worldview with his words about the power of music, and she felt a complex mixture of emotions. Part of her wanted to comfort him, to somehow bridge the gap between who he had been and who he had become. But another part of her was angry at what he represented, at the choices he had made that had led him to this place. "What happened to you?" she asked softly. "What happened to the young man who believed that music could change the world?" Wilhelm looked up at her, his eyes red from crying, and Maria could see the weight of 20 years of compromise and disappointment in his expression. "The world changed me instead," he said simply. Wilhelm stood up slowly and walked to a cabinet in the corner of the room. He pulled out a military-issued shirt and handed it to Maria, who gratefully put it on. Finally able to cover herself and regain some sense of dignity, the simple act seemed to restore some normalcy to the surreal situation they found themselves in. "After that tour ended, I was supposed to audition for the National Symphony," Wilhelm said, his voice still shaky but more controlled now. "But then my father died unexpectedly, and I had to return home to take care of my mother and younger sister. My family lost everything in the economic collapse that followed the war. The symphony position went to someone else." Maria listened intently as he continued his story, trying to reconcile this vulnerable man with the stern commander who had been terrorizing prisoners just hours earlier. "I took whatever work I could find, playing in bars and restaurants, giving piano lessons to children whose families could barely afford them, but it wasn't enough. My mother became ill, and medical care was expensive. My sister needed an education. So when the military started recruiting men with leadership potential and offering good salaries, I convinced myself it was temporary. Wilhelm sat back down, staring at his hands as if he could still see piano keys beneath his fingers. I told myself I would serve for a few years, save money, and then return to music. But the military has a way of drawing you in deeper and deeper. They recognize talent, even musical talent, because it translates to discipline and attention to detail. Maria found herself feeling sympathy for this man, despite everything he represented. She understood how circumstances could force someone to make choices they never thought they would make. Her own journey from nurse to resistance fighter had taught her that survival sometimes required compromises with your ideals. I rose through the ranks quickly, Wilhelm continued. I was good at following orders, good at organizing people, good at solving problems. Before I knew it, I was an officer, then a senior officer, and then a commander. Each promotion came with better pay, more security for my family, and less time to think about the music I had left behind. But how did you end up here? Maria asked. How did you become the kind of person who could order women to be humiliated and degraded? Wilhelm flinched at her directness, but he didn't try to defend himself. I convinced myself that I was just following orders, that I wasn't responsible for the policies I was implementing. I told myself that if I wasn't doing this job, someone worse would be. And at least I could try to minimize the damage. Maria thought about the other prisoners, about Alina and Anna and all the women who had gone through this same degrading process. Did you minimize the damage? She asked pointedly. I thought I was, Wilhelm said quietly. I insisted on medical professionals being present during examinations. I prohibited certain forms of physical abuse that other commanders allowed. I made sure prisoners received adequate food and medical care. But you're right to question me. None of that justifies what I've become. There was a long silence, as both of them contemplated the weight of their conversation. Maria looked at this man who had once inspired her with his vision of music's power to transcend suffering, and she saw how completely he had lost his way. But she also saw something else. A flicker of the person he used to be, buried beneath years of military conditioning and moral compromise. Do you ever play anymore? She asked suddenly. Wilhelm looked surprised by the question. No, he said. I haven't touched a piano in over 10 years. I tell myself I don't have time, but the truth is I'm afraid. I'm afraid that if I play, I'll remember who I used to be, and I won't be able to live with who I've become. Maria made a decision that surprised even herself. There's an old piano in the chaplain's office, she said. I've seen it when they take prisoners there for questioning. It's probably out of tune, but it still works. Wilhelm stared at her in amazement. Why are you telling me this? Because 20 years ago, you gave a little girl something beautiful to hold on to during the darkest times of her life. That music got me through my parents' death, through watching my village burn, through being captured and brought to this place. Maybe it's time for you to remember what you gave me. Wilhelm was quiet for a long time, and Maria could see him struggling with emotions he had buried for years. Finally, he spoke in a voice so soft she had to strain to hear him. I don't know if I can find my way back to who I used to be, he said. Maybe you can't, Maria replied honestly, but maybe you can find a way to become someone better than who you are now. The next few hours passed in a strange, dreamlike state. Wilhelm had Maria return to a private cell instead of the general population, telling his subordinates that she required additional questioning. In reality, he needed time to process what had happened and decide what to do next. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning not just a specific order, but the entire path his life had taken. That evening, after the camp had settled into its nightly routine, Wilhelm made his way to the chaplain's office. The chaplain was away visiting another facility, and the office was empty and dark. Wilhelm found the piano exactly where Maria had said it would be, covered with a dusty sheet and surrounded by stacks of religious books and papers. He pulled away the sheet and ran, his fingers over the keys without pressing them, feeling their familiar texture and remembering the countless hours he had spent practicing scales and arpeggios as a young man. His hands looked different now, weathered by years of military service and marked by a scar on his right hand from a training accident. But muscle memory was a powerful thing. When he finally pressed down on middle C, the note rang out clear and true, though slightly flat from years of neglect. Wilhelm tuned the piano as best he could with the tools available, a process that brought back memories of his music school days when he had worked as a piano technician to pay for his education. As he began to play the opening notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the same piece he had performed in Maria's village all those years ago, Wilhelm felt emotions flooding through him that he had kept locked away for decades. The music seemed to unlock something deep inside him, something that military discipline and the demands of survival had forced him to suppress. He played for hours, working through pieces he had memorized in his youth and discovering that his fingers still remembered even the most complex passages. Bach's Goldberg Variations, Chopin's Nocturnes, Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 11. All of them came flowing back as if he had played them just yesterday. With each piece, Wilhelm felt more of his old self returning, but also more pain at what he had become. The beauty of the music made the ugliness of his current life seem even more stark and unbearable. He thought about Maria, about the little girl who had looked at him with such wonder and admiration, and about the woman she had become despite everything the world had thrown at her. The next morning, Wilhelm made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. He called for Maria to be brought to his office. Not the interrogation room where prisoners were usually taken, but his private office where he conducted administrative business. When she arrived, escorted by 2 guards who looked confused by the unusual request, Wilhelm dismissed them and closed the door. Maria looked wary but not as frightened as she had the day before, as if their shared experience had created some kind of bond between them despite their circumstances. "I played last night," Wilhelm told her without preamble. "For the first time in 10 years, I played the piano." Maria's face showed a mixture of surprise and something that might have been hope. "How did it feel?" she asked. "Like waking up from a very long, very dark dream," Wilhelm replied, "and like realizing that I've been sleepwalking through the most important years of my life." Wilhelm walked to the window and looked out at the camp courtyard where prisoners were beginning their morning routine. "I can't undo the things I've done," he said. "I can't bring back the dignity I've stolen from hundreds of women, or erase the pain I've caused in the name of following orders. But maybe I can prevent some future harm." "What are you thinking of doing?" Maria asked, though she seemed to sense that whatever he was planning would be dangerous for both of them. Wilhelm turned back to face her, and Maria could see that his eyes held a determination that hadn't been there before. "I'm thinking of remembering who I used to be," he said, "and acting accordingly." Over the next several days, subtle changes began to occur in the camp's routine. Examinations became less frequent and less invasive. Food portions increased slightly. Guards were instructed to treat prisoners with more basic human dignity, though Wilhelm had to be careful about how he implemented these changes to avoid suspicion from his superiors. More importantly, Wilhelm began using his position to gather intelligence about planned transfers and executions, information that he quietly passed along through channels that eventually reached resistance networks operating in the area. He couldn't save everyone, but he could save some, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something that aligned with his true values, rather than simply following orders. 3 weeks after their fateful encounter, Wilhelm received orders that made his blood run cold. High Command had decided that Camp Delta was becoming too costly to maintain, and all prisoners were to be transferred to a facility known for its much harsher conditions and significantly lower survival rates. The transfer was scheduled for the following morning. Wilhelm knew that this transfer would likely be a death sentence for many of the women, including Maria. He had been walking a careful line between his official duties and his conscience. But now he was faced with a choice that would define the rest of his life, however long that might be. That evening, Wilhelm made his way to the chaplain's office one last time. He played Bach's air on the G-string, a piece that had always moved him to tears even as a young man. As the beautiful, mournful melody filled the empty room, Wilhelm made peace with what he was about to do. At 3 a.m., Wilhelm implemented a plan he had been developing for days. Using his command authority and forged transfer orders, he organized what appeared to be a routine prisoner transport. Instead of the official transport trucks that were scheduled to arrive in the morning, Wilhelm arranged for vehicles driven by resistant sympathizers who had been waiting for an opportunity to strike against the facility. The operation required precise timing and absolute. Wilhelm had to convince his guards that this was an authorized early transfer, while simultaneously ensuring that the prisoners understood they needed to cooperate completely to avoid arousing suspicion. Maria proved invaluable in this regard, quietly spreading word among the other women that something unusual was happening, but that they needed to follow all instructions without question as the women were loaded into the trucks in the pre-dawn darkness. Wilhelm felt his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. He was betraying everything he had sworn to uphold as a military officer, but for the first time in decades, his actions aligned with the values that had once defined him. The trucks pulled away from Camp Delta just as the first light of dawn was beginning to appear on the horizon. Wilhelm watched them disappear down the mountain road. Knowing that he had just committed an act that would be considered treason by his superiors, but that felt more right than anything he had done since putting on a military uniform. Wilhelm didn't try to run or hide. He knew that the deception would be discovered within hours, and that he would face severe consequences for his actions. Instead, he returned to the chaplain's office and played piano until the guards came for him, which they did less than 2 hours after the truck's departure. During his court-martial, Wilhelm never expressed any regret for his actions. He told the tribunal that he had simply remembered who he was supposed to be and had acted accordingly. His military career was over, and he faced execution for treason. But for the first time in years, Wilhelm Brass felt at peace with himself. Maria and the other women made it safely to a resistant stronghold in the mountains, where they were given new identities and helped to escape to neutral territory. Maria never forgot the man who had sacrificed everything to save her and 179 other women. The pianist who had rediscovered his humanity in the most unlikely of circumstances. Years later, after the war ended, Maria would tell her children and grandchildren about the power of music to transform lives and reveal truth. She would speak of a young pianist who had once inspired a little girl with his vision of beauty and hope, and who had ultimately lived up to that vision even when it cost him everything. Wilhelm was executed 6 weeks after the escape, but not before writing a letter that was smuggled out of prison and eventually reached Maria. In it, he thanked her for reminding him of who he had once been, and for giving him the courage to become the person he should have been all along. He ended the letter with the words he had spoken to a 7-year-old girl in a village, squared 20 years earlier. Music is stronger than anything else in the world, including the darkness that sometimes overwhelms us. Hold on to beauty, and you will never be truly lost. Maria kept that letter for the rest of her life, along with the memory of how a small tattoo had changed the course of history for 180 women and one lost pianist who found his way home through the power of remembered music.